Farm to Table, Volume 1, Growing Up.
Written by Rock, narrated by Rock. Forward.
When I was 10 years old, I remember riding along with my uncle in his milk truck. We would drop off empty cans and pick up the full ones. There were many small farms in rural Wisconsin back in those days. I can still remember the taste of the fresh cheese curds when we unloaded at the creamery that evening. Later in my teen years, I worked on a fruit and vegetable farm. We would plant, water, fertilize, and eventually harvest. It always seemed to be the same. We would produce, and then it would be trucked to the processor or straight to the market. Now, many years later, I have the privilege of hauling heavy equipment in Metro Atlanta. As we drive across this great country and see the miles and miles of corn, soybean, wheat, citrus groves, and many other food sources, well, the farmers may feed the nations, but the truckers supply the lifeline. The link that holds these two together is the broker. Like everything in life, communication and connection is the key. Rock has established herself among the best in this business. Having connection with the producer and the consumer, she fills the void with her relationship with the trucker. This certainly does not happen overnight. It takes time, patience, and surrounding yourself with great employees. Her rise to success was not just by chance. It takes dedication, perseverance, and a whole lot of help from God above. But Rock isn't just an entrepreneur. She is a pastor, a teacher, and a counselor, a life coach, and very happy to say, my friend. So buckle up and hang on to this fast-paced journey that she calls life.
Chapter 1.
Growing up in California and Las Vegas. It all started in 1957 when I clocked into the planet in California. According to the pictures I saw, it looked a lot like a happy family of mom, dad, brothers, and sisters. Back in 1957, most people looked like a normal American family. So as far as I knew, that's what it was until my dad, Gustav Schunk, decided to move his happy little family to Las Vegas, Nevada. Gustav was basically a bag man for the mob. In those days, he would fly from Las Vegas to Detroit, to Chicago, to New York, all of the big cities. He would carry money from the mob from city to city. Frances was my mother, and she did some bookkeeping back then for the old school mobsters. Our little family looked kind of normal to the outside world, but there was nothing normal about it. Back in the early 60s, there was no cure for measles, mumps, chickenpox, etc. I can remember having the very brutal German measles, along with my little brother Tiki. I can still picture our pitch-black room we were stuck in with our eyes matted shut and fevers raging as high as 105 degrees. My mother and another lady took care of us. I remember the door to our room being cracked open. They were playing cards and smoking, and they would take turns coming into the room and wiping us down with cool water to bring down the fever. There wasn't much they could do, so all we had to do was ride it out. It took about 8 days in the dark room until the fever finally broke, and we were able to sit up in the bed and begin to recover. I knew even back then that my brother and I were being taken care of by a power higher than 2 women smoking cigarettes. My little brother's name is actually Terry, but his nickname stuck when we would tickle him, saying "Tiki, Tiki, Tiki." He was 18 months younger than me and was always on my tail. My name being Roxanne, they shortened it up to anything but. Roxy, Rocky, Rox, Rocco, Rock, you name it, they used it. I can remember even at 5 years old, knowing that there was something wrong with my family, but I didn't know exactly what. Just that I always felt creepy and didn't have my clothes or shoes and was too young to understand why. Alcohol was the bomb in Las Vegas. Everybody had a stocked bar. So I was actually living with a bunch of alcoholics. Being so young, I really didn't know what that was, except that I really needed somebody to help me and my little brother. My mother would take Tiki and me to the Baptist church on a Sunday, give us a dime for the collection plate, and drop us off. We were so young. All I remember is tall people with suits and my mother telling me to make sure that I put the dime in the plate that they passed around. My mother, Frances, was a beautiful woman, tall, dark-skinned, and very kind spirit. Gustav was a short, going bald, and seemed to be the issue in our family. One day, the old dude came into the kitchen and said, "Do you know what's going on?" He began to eat a bowl of cereal at the breakfast bar and was wearing a black shirt. I was about 8 by then. I said, "No, what's going on?" He said, "I'm leaving. I'm leaving you here with your mother." I looked at him and told him, "Okay, bye," and that was it. No emotion, no crying, no feelings about it one way or the other. I knew my mother was not a tough guy. I was actually tougher than she was when I was only 8 years old. I actually felt sorry for her. She couldn't control Tiki, and just like the typical scenario, the man leaves the kids to run amok. I suppose it does happen like that sometimes. My kid brother and I were introduced to drugs very early in life. Again, when I was only 8 years old. I was always trying to help my mother control my baby brother when I didn't even know what I was doing. This is one time my brother got a hold of some acid. They called it LSD, or orange sunshine. Tiki was very young and the stuff made him crazy. I can remember my mother trying to subdue him as he started flopping around on the floor like a madman. He then bit my mom in the leg. I was totally mortified and grabbed Tiki and drug him away from my mom as she started crying. I was always trying to help her control things. Somehow, I always knew I had a big reason to be living on the earth. My favorite song was Way Down Upon the Swanee River. I was fascinated by the peninsula of Florida, and I remember saying as a young kid in the 6th grade or so how cool it would be to live on a peninsula. Las Vegas was very, very small back in the 60s. Even back then, Fremont Street, the Strip, was Sin City. One could always walk around anywhere, taking in all the riffraff, the gamblers, and the bums. Back then, to get around, you could either hitchhike or take the bus. One of my bad hitchhiking experiences was when I was 10. I was with a girlfriend. We got picked up by an old man. He said he would drop us off on a street called Charleston. I got in the back and my friend Laura got in the front. The old man drove about 35 miles an hour and started fondling Laura, so I yelled at her to get ready to jump. We jumped out at the same time as the car continued its speed, and we landed right in front of a Mormon church. We were both freaked out, so we crawled up on the grass and swore we would never hitchhike again. That sure was a close call. Who knows what could have happened? As a kid, I always had this constant battle on my shoulders. On one shoulder was a good guy telling me good stuff to do, and on the other shoulder was a bad guy telling me bad stuff to do. Unfortunately, I never had anyone to talk to or to provide any spiritual guidance on this. My mom ultimately got remarried and was usually out at the bars when she wasn't at work. Because of this, I would watch out for my little brother, trying to make sure he stayed out of trouble. But in Las Vegas on the street, it was almost impossible. I had a few Hispanic Mexican friends who had parents as lost as we were. My 5th grade teacher, Mr. Atkinson, saw my signature one day and told me, "I don't know who you are going to be, but you can take my pen with you and write with it." And all the kids hated me for that, but it didn't matter. I knew I had a mission in life. I really didn't know what to do as a little kid. My mom would give me and Tiki $1 every day and tell us to go to the Burger King, and off she went to the bar. From that single dollar, I was able to take the bus and gallivant all over Las Vegas at such a young age. Tiki ultimately got hooked on heroin, but I would often save my dollars and loan it to other kids. I often wondered how I knew how to make a deal at such a young age, but I just went with it. When I was in my room at home during this time, it was often very creepy. My stepfather's name was Vernon Cooley. One time he tried to get into bed with me as a young kid, so I ran for my life down the street to the neighbor. She let me stay there until my mom got back from a trip to Portland, Oregon. I left Tiki there, and when my mom came home to pick me up, I told her what happened. She didn't believe me. For a kid, that was devastating. I was only 11. I was telling the truth. Every time I would be in my room wondering what I was going to do to help my baby brother, a peace would come in and take the darkness away. I didn't know what it was back then, but I just knew the sense of peace would help me. It actually seemed like a voice, but I wasn't totally sure if it was a bad guy or a good guy. The voice once told me that my mother was going to die when I was very young. So I asked Mom about it. She came into my room drunk one night and sat on the bed. I told her what the voice said, and she told me not to worry about it, that Vern would take good care of me if it actually did happen. Well, I knew that wasn't going to happen, so I just cried myself to sleep. There was so much darkness in my home that I would walk around the streets barefoot in the desert until my feet began to crack and bleed. I also got these boils all over me. My mom was never there. My little brother, Tiki, was wasted, and I had an older brother, Jerry, and a sister, Francine, but they were grown and raised and out of the house. So the voice told me to go down to the pool. Unfortunately, you had to be an adult to go in. So I waited for a family and jumped in with all their kids and dipped into the pool every day for several days. The chlorine healed my body from the boils. At that point, I was still just a young kid. I didn't know what to do, but the voice I kept listening to knew everything. After the attack of the boils and the cracked and bleeding feet was over, I got some other kind of sickness, so I stayed home from school one day. The phone rang as I was laying on the floor watching TV. There was only 2 channels back then, and Vern was home that day. He was a fireman, 7 days on, 7 days off, and I heard him say, "Okay, I'll be right there." I knew then it was my mom, and it was when she was at work. I found out that she bent down to pick up a pencil, and as she stood back up, she had a cerebral hemorrhage of the brain. The voice that told me my mom would pass was absolutely right. My sister, who also lived in Vegas, had her own little family and was pregnant. She came to pick me up to take me and my brother to the hospital. She was absolutely freaking out. I really didn't know her very well at the time because we were 11 years apart in age. Her name was Franny, but some called her Fang. She took me to the hospital and I saw my mother in that room. I got a chance to squeeze her hand one last time. I would often go into her room at night and take the cigarette out of her hand while she was falling asleep. I never forgot what kind of cigarettes she smoked, Silva Thins, which I don't think they make anymore. This particular cigarettes were dainty, much like Virginia Slims. I actually liked the Virginia Slims logo, "You've come a long way, baby." That would become my mantra later in life. I noticed towards the end of her life that Mom often read her Bible and was on her chest as she fell asleep. I think she was like an old whipped dog. She knew her time was coming. Mom was very young, only 42 years old. She did die like the voice said she would, and my brother and I didn't shed a tear at her funeral. That was very sad that neither one of us could even cry. Right before Mom died, I got pregnant by a 17-year-old boy who would often take me to his grandma's house and take advantage of me. I was only 12 years old at the time, so I really didn't know what I was doing, let alone getting pregnant. I was petrified when I didn't have my period. I didn't know anything at all about pregnancy. I was never told anything about it. I told my mom and she freaked out. She told my sister and that was it. It was on. This was back in the day when abortion was illegal. I found out that my mother had actually had several abortions where the females would help each other terminate their pregnancies with wire coat hangers. I was shocked, very young and naive. My sister got my mom, who put me in the car, and they drove me to a very creepy house. It almost looked like a castle. It was in California. The fog, which I had never seen before, was thick as we pulled into the place in the wee hours of the morning. I was so scared. My mom was crying while my sister was yelling, and I was just like a sheep caught for the slaughter. I went into this place, and there was women lined up from 8 to 9 months pregnant to abort their babies. They took me to a scary room and put me on a gurney, then laid me out right next to a lady who seemed to be in her late 40s or 50s. She looked over me, and with tears streaming down her face, she said, "How old are you, honey?" I told her, and she just looked away. The next thing I remember is someone waking me up and telling me to sit up and dangle my feet. I did what they said, and that was it. It was done. I got back in the car with my mom and my sister, and nobody said a word all the way back to Las Vegas. I often wondered what it would have happened to me if I would have had the baby. Would I be writing this book, or would I have been down a very different trail and a very different person? I don't know. I knew the voice that had spoken to me when I was a lot younger was there with me the whole time. After Mom's death, that meant game on for me. I was 12, my brother was 10, and the older siblings were coming in to take charge. My sister worked for a law firm in Las Vegas, which helped her to ultimately get the house away from Vern Cooley. Right after the funeral, Tiki and I decided to go visit Vern, who moved out of the house as soon as my mom died. He had gotten an apartment. We walked everywhere trying to figure out where he lived. We wanted to confront him and tell him we wanted some money for our mother's estate since it was hers before he moved in. I will never forget Tiki and me walking up the 2 flights of stairs at the apartment complex where he lived. We knocked on the door and he opened it, asking what we wanted. I bowed up since I was the spokesman and said we wanted some money or something for my mom's stuff so we could get by. I will never forget his sinister laugh. It was awful and very scary. Vern was scary looking anyway. He had big red splotches on his face from the incessant drinking all the time, and anyway, old Vern proceeded to slam the door in our faces. I looked at my brother, he looked at me, and we burst out laughing. You'd thought that we'd be mad or cussing or something, but we just laughed and walked back down the concrete steps and said, "Oh well, at least we tried." Unfortunately, my older brother Jerry came in fighting for his portion of the estate. Even as a kid, I remember thinking I wasn't ever going to be like that, ever. When I was 14, I took off on foot to downtown Las Vegas, looking for a job. The responses were no, 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 until I got to a place called Reliable Bail Bonds. When I walked in, there was a cowboy-looking dude with his feet propped up on the back of the desk. I went in and I said, "I'm looking for a job." He asked me how old I was. I lied and told him I was 16. He stood up and said, "Okay, only if you go into the back room with me." I started yelling and he quickly calmed me down and said, "Take it easy. Now I'm going to open the door to the back room so you can look back there. If you don't want to go, you don't have to. But if you do, then okay." He stood back and held the door so I could look inside. It was a bunch of ladies on the telephones, the old cross-connect type. He said, "Do you want to go?" I told him yes. He walked me over to this lady. Her name was Donna. He said, "I want you to take this one under your wing." So there you have it, my first job with an answering service. We answered the phones for lawyers, bookies, doctors, veterinarians, hookers, and the eye in the sky that watched tables for cheaters. You name it, they were on the board. And that's how I started my working career.
Chapter 2.
Learning work ethics. When I started working for the answering service, my sister let me buy her car so I'd have a dependable transportation. I ended up working there until I grew up and was later the supervisor over women over 40. They absolutely hated me. Oh well, I would go the extra mile and learned a tremendous work ethic. That's how I got ahead. There was one company on the board called AM and PM. Their service provided car repairs. They'd come out if you were broke down in the middle of the night on the side of the road, and they would fix your car. They would call me, and I would beep a mechanic. One day I was working by myself, and the doctors and lawyers were all checking out of their offices, telling me where they would be on call and where they were going to eat that night. Behind me, I heard a slam on the half door we had, which led into the control room. I looked back, and this dude was standing there telling me to give him an outside line. I wasn't very happy with this. I jumped up, cussed him out, asked him how he got into the locked building. He told me he was with AM and PM, and one of the girls had let him in. I asked him what he wanted, and he said, "I want to go on a date with you." Dating was the furthest thing from my mind. I told him no and threw him out. Let's say his name was Russ. He was a good-looking dude, but I wasn't looking for a man. The girls in the answering service told me he was married, so when he called to ask me out again, I told him I didn't date married men. He told me he was divorced. He kept persisting, and I finally agreed to go on a date with him. When he arrived to pick me up, he took me to one of the most expensive restaurants in Las Vegas. When we pulled into the parking lot, I said, "No way. We aren't eating here." He asked me why and that he had the money. I really didn't care if he had the money or not. The fridge at my studio apartment was bare. I wasn't watching him blow $400 on one single meal. Russ asked if I had any food at my apartment, and I told him no. He said he would take me to the grocery store and buy me some groceries so we could cook some steaks at my apartment. I agreed with this plan. It was then that he wrote me in, and I started to date Russ. Russ seemed to have the same views on things I did: God, the world, and similar beliefs. But I could always see that he was a family man. I was told by an OBGYN that I would never have any children because of what had happened when I was younger. I honestly really didn't want any children at the time. I thought I would spend my life in Las Vegas working, and that would be it. Thankfully, God had a different plan. The phone rang one day. Now, this was back in the day where there was no cell phones, only pagers. This lady was on the line named Joyce, and she said she was Russ's mother. Like I said, I was a little bit testy when I was younger, so I wasn't happy with this call. Anyway, Joyce proceeded to tell me that Russ was indeed married. I told her exactly what he had told me, that he was divorced. She told me that he was not. Only was he not married, that his wife was pregnant. So I told his mother I would make him go back to Miami to his family. When I told Russ his mother called, he said, "I'm staying with you." I told him that he needed to go back to his wife because she was going to have their child. He wouldn't listen, so I tried throwing him out. He wouldn't go. Then I started feeling sick to my stomach in the mornings. Back then, you had no choice but to go to Planned Parenthood. I really didn't have much money, but the lady told me I was pregnant and tried to get me to sign an abortion sheet. I ran out of the building, down the street, just freaking out on how fast they came at me. This wasn't going to happen again. I called Russ and told him the news. He was happy as a lark, but I was absolutely freaking out. I wasn't married, but he was, to someone else. And I had a kid on the way in Florida. He said he didn't care. He was staying with me. Later on, I had the baby. It was a girl, and I named her Jody. Russ was a happy camper who wanted to have a family, and I knew that. But my sister told me that our mother would roll over in her grave if she knew I wasn't married and having a baby. So I told Russ we needed to get married. Well, like I said, he was already married to a lady in Florida. He came home from work one night, and I told him the baby would have to take my last name because we weren't married, and I was going to raise her. He went berserk and choked me out on the kitchen floor. I passed out, and when I woke up, his tears were dripping in my face. He said, "I promise you, I'll never touch you again." It was a miracle that both me and Jody didn't die that day. So he kicked into gear, got divorced, and my sister, Franny, decided to throw me a wedding at her house. My sister lived in a real nice subdivision, worked for some lawyers. Franny and Paul, her husband, through the wedding, and I was 8 months pregnant with Jody, miserable and pretty much over it, and out of patience. So there we were, getting married at Franny's house. Russ invited all his friends. He was the leader of some biker group, and my sister invited all her lawyer friends. So it was the bikers and the lawyers. Wow. As you might have expected, it was an absolute nightmare. The bikers stripped down and skinny dipped in her pool. Russ ended up throwing my sister into the pool while she was still decked out for the wedding. When we were saying the vows, Russ didn't say until death do we part. He said until we kicked the bucket. The bikers thought it was funny, but it was awful. Some miscellaneous girl showed up in black hot pants and was doing some awful things upstairs. At the wedding reception, I was walking around crying. My sister told me to get the heathen out of her house, and I was totally mortified. When it was time to leave, we went to get in the car, and it had suckers written on the side. It couldn't have been more humiliating. Russ thought it was pretty funny. I didn't. We didn't even talk during our wedding night and actually slept on the floor mattress in the house I found for a sweat equity deal. The whole thing was like a huge nightmare. I gave birth to Jody by C-section in the Women's Hospital in Las Vegas. She was adorable, beautiful. I had no one to help me with the baby because Franny was still upset from the wedding fiasco. I didn't blame her. I had a rough time with the C-section because back in those days, it was a fairly new thing. So it was like a living hell trying to get through raising a newborn with no help. Russ stayed at work all the time. Adding to the challenge of raising a newborn, he called me up one day and informed me that a bunch of the guys were going to the cat house. He asked me if I minded if he joined them. What else would I say? Sure, I got this. I'll take care of our daughter. He actually went and took off work for and then I took off work for a couple of months to take care of Jody. When Jody was 3 weeks old, the phone rang, and it was Russ's sister, Margaret. She said that her brother had gotten killed on a tractor. He was only 17 years old, and they needed Russ to come home. So he told me to pack up. We're going to Florida. At that time, I'd never been out of Las Vegas. For a very long time, I did not want to go. I was only 3 weeks into being a mother and had not even healed from major surgery when this happened. I was in a lot of pain and exhausted, so I cried and cried. But Russ told me to get in the car, so off we went. It seemed like we went 150 miles an hour in a 1965 Ford Fairlane, all the way to a farm in Live Oak, Florida. The trip was over 2,000 miles, and we got there in a day and a half of constant driving. When we pulled in, it was at night. I'd never seen trees with moss hanging from them before. It was foggy. The little house out in the middle of nowhere was a bit scary. Actually, I was kind of freaked out. Russ's mother had experienced some sort of panic episode due to her son's death, so his dad came and got baby Jody and laid her down beside my mother-in-law. This brought some life to where there was nothing but death. Gramps, Russ's dad, came out crying and thanked me for bringing his son and his baby all the way to the farm. I was exhausted. They led me to a creepy room upstairs and told me to get some rest, and God certainly knew I needed some. The next day, I woke to the aroma of bacon throughout the house. At this, I went downstairs and saw Gramps cooking breakfast while the women were on the front porch with the baby Jody. Now, I met these women before. I had only talked to Grandma Joyce on the phone. The first thing out of the great-grandma's mouth was, "You don't know how to take care of a baby." I agreed that I didn't. This woman was meaner than a snake. They called her Big Mama, and she looked angry all the time. I sat off in the corner, feeling much like an intruder, while they had taken control of my baby. Who knew where Russ was? He wasn't there to save me. You could tell we were from two different worlds, and I was way out of my comfort zone. The family had gathered together for the death of the brother, and there seemed to be a lot of them. And then there was little old me, a Las Vegas girl. Big Mama didn't even know me and kept looking at me like I was some miscellaneous tramp who Russ dug up. I just kept quiet and hoped to God we would soon leave and that nightmare would be over. When it came time to go, Russ said to me, "We are leaving Jody behind." I absolutely freaked out and came unglued. I may not have been a great mother yet, but I knew one thing. I wasn't going to leave my baby there. I also knew I wasn't going back to Las Vegas without her. So we stayed a bit longer until it was definitely time to go home. Man, I was sure glad we were leaving. We finally got back to Vegas. Russ went back to work and his family called again. This time they wanted Russ to come back and run the farm, the whole 80 acres. I told him no. I fought him pretty hard about this, but finally agreed. I told my husband that I'd put our house on the market, figuring that likely it wouldn't sell for a long time and that he'd hopefully forget about the whole thing. Well, it was a sweat equity property, so I got all my husband's biker buddies to come and help me fix it up. I couldn't have foreseen that it would only take one day to sell on the market. It sold for exactly what I was asking for. I couldn't believe it. That's when I knew there was a greater power at work behind the scenes. Russ was ecstatic. We sold the house and made 25 grand. I was only 19, and that was a lot of money to me. He told me we needed to send the money to his mother. We did. We sent the majority to her and loaded an old truck that looked like the Clampetts on the Beverly Hillbillies. For real, there was a high chair tied on the side of the wooden side of the bed with all of our junk. Anyway, with that, we headed to Florida. I cried and cried halfway across the desert, not knowing why or where I was going. I still had the two imaginary guys on my shoulders. The one guy was good, and the other guy was bad. We drove and drove and drove. Unfortunately, we broke down in Texas. The water pump went out. I had to leave Jody with Russ and go into town 200 miles away to get a water pump for a truck I knew absolutely nothing about. Talk about stress. When I finally got to the parts store, the guy said it would be this one or that one. I said, "Buddy, give me both of them. I'm not showing back up with the wrong one." Only God knows how I got back to where they were. There was no GPS back then, just angels guiding me along. So when I found them, Russ had made friends with an old couple who had stopped to help him. Russ had a bunch of Coors beer, like 20 cases or so. He told me that they didn't sell it in Florida, so he traded some Coors beer to the old couple for some milk for our daughter. It was absolutely crazy. Russ finally got the truck running, and we were off again. I was driving our car, which was a 1977 T-Bird, and he had the truck with all our junk. Most people had U-Hauls for a move like this, but not us. It was only by God's grace that we finally arrived in Live Oak, Florida. On the way there, I previously never noticed on our trip there for the funeral, so it wasn't until I pulled down this dusty trail at the property that the name on the sign was Rocky Acres. For me, that was a sign from God because one of my nicknames was Rocky. I felt like I was on the right path. Even though it was pretty creepy, Granny and Gramps were out there to greet us and came running to the truck. The joy I saw on their faces made it all worth the trip. So there we were on the farm. I didn't have a clue what to do, where we were going, or how we would live or sleep. I only knew that his mom had our money. We had to do something. They lived in a creepy little farmhouse that was a couple of old single wide trailers on the property. So Granny says, "Why don't you get a trailer over in Lake City and set it up out here somewhere?" I couldn't have moved fast enough. Rocky Acres was no small farm. It had 80 acres, but it was pure wilderness for me. I actually tried several farming events, such as picking pecans. It seemed pretty easy to pick them off the ground, and I was young and eager to conquer anything. I would go out there all day and only pick up a quarter of a gunny sack of pecans. An elderly lady would come to the farm with her lunch and her grandkid, and by the end of the day, about 4 o'clock, she would leave with her burlap sack completely full. I didn't know what I was doing wrong, So I talked Russ's brother and got him into shaking the pecan tree with a tractor after I put a tarp around the tree. Ultimately, I figured that this just wasn't for me. I attempted to pick up tomatoes, corn, and squash for canning, so I dressed the part, went into the Gramps' garden to pick up vegetables, starting with the tomatoes I saw. Bugs were all over them, and I was not happy with this. I backed up in the garden to avoid some giant worms and thought I was bit by a snake. I suddenly fell down to the ground yelling that I had been bitten, and the boys on the farm who were working on the tractor looked over and started laughing. They were all about my age, around 19. I didn't think it was so funny that they wouldn't come and help me, so I yelled, "Why?" And one of them told me to turn around and look at the wire that surrounded the garden. It was a live wire to keep animals out. At this, I got angry and stormed home. Obviously, I was trying to be a farmer, but it wasn't coming naturally. I would take my daughter every day and visit a certain cow, which was penned up. We would talk to the cow as we petted. It was our friend. So one day, this dude shows up to the farm with everybody was gone that day, but me. He told me he was there to shoot the cow as he spit some tobacco. I was absolutely mortified at this. He ended up shooting the cow, and I found out later that evening that we were eating cows all along. I never thought about this when I lived in Vegas because your meat was just packaged up and ready to go in the stores. So there I was, 19 years old, before I found out that meat was actually coming from cows, pigs, and whatever. Wow, city life and country life were very, very different. I noticed some small things that had happened in my life to get me to this farm. One of my favorite songs in the 6th grade was Way Down Upon the Swanee River. When I found out the river was only a quarter mile from Rocky Acres, this was certainly no coincidence. So instead of feeling like I had been shortchanged, I started flowing into what appeared to be my destiny. We all wonder about our destinies at some point, don't we? So I bought a double-wide trailer, put it on the farm. My life was noticeably different from the concrete jungle to the dusty trail at Rocky Acres was obviously quite a change. I actually learned a lot on the farm. I was still just 19 years old, full of life, but I still had a city girl mentality. Sometimes I wanted to just go hail a cab and go wait for it. On the farm, I learned to be a traditional woman, to cook and to take care of a family. I also learned how to slow down and consider a thing. As soon as my trailer was all set up, I became pregnant with Samantha, my second daughter. I expected it to be a normal pregnancy as we chilled on the farm in the middle of nowhere. Well, it wasn't like that at all. I was 5 months into the pregnancy when I was picking up Jody, as I normally did. I was putting her into the bathtub. I felt a warm sensation of what I thought was water going down my legs. I looked down and it was blood. Back in those days, they had phones with party lines, which meant you shared a line with other people. I knew I needed to call Granny to tell her how much blood there was and to get her over there to help me. I can remember lying down on the couch, grabbing my stomach and saying these words, "God, you know and I know. I can't lose this baby. What do I do?" That familiar calming voice simply told me, "Go and lay down." When you're 19, you really don't want to lay down to rest, especially in a new place, learning all new things with a little baby already running around. So I got Granny to watch Jody, and I laid down for several days until the bleeding stopped. Now, most people would have rushed to the doctor or hospital at this point, but not me. I figured I had this. Unfortunately, I didn't. Russ had been working on the farm, and he didn't pay anything, so I told him it would be smart to get a job, especially with the second kid coming. He then got a job, and this was where I was introduced to the trucks. One day I was laying there when I heard this loud horn outside. I went out to see what it was. It was my husband with a semi. I don't remember what kind it was. I just thought it was cool. He said, "Hey, Rock, I got a job driving this truck." I said, "Wow, how much does it pay?" This was back in the late 70s. So when he said $400 a week, I was blown away. Back then, that was a lot of money. I didn't realize at first that it would take my partner out on the road for weeks at a time. So at that point, I started to get the concept of keep on trucking. Basically, Russ left me barefoot and pregnant on the farm with his parents way down upon the Swanee River, and he hit the road. I found a doctor who helped me through the pregnancy, and he told me the same thing, to stay lying down. I decided to fly to Las Vegas instead. So I got in a car with my little daughter Jody, who was jumping around excitedly, and headed for Atlanta to take the flight. When I got outside of Atlanta, I felt that sensation again and looked down, and I was sitting in a pool of blood. Only God knows how I found the motel where Russ was staying at 1 a.m. in the morning, but I did. I pulled up and everything was quiet, so I laid on the horn. The manager came running out. I told him my husband was in this motel somewhere and I needed to find him because I was pregnant and hemorrhaging and was unable to get out of the car. The dude moved pretty fast. He found Russ, who jumped in the car, told me to scoot over, and asked the manager where the nearest hospital was. We then took off. I didn't know that then, but when there are 2 lives at stake, the hospital moves a lot faster. They wheeled me in and told me to stay flat on my back for 30 days. Being a smoker from Las Vegas, I tried to bribe the dude on the cleaning crew to bring me some cigarettes, but he wouldn't do it. So I called Gramps in Live Oak, Florida, and told Gramps they released me from the hospital and he could come and get me. They really didn't release me, but I was overstaying there, being by myself. So he came and got me and took me back to the farm. I was supposed to lay down all day, and the church ladies would come and do wash and cleaning. I couldn't stand that. I was independent and didn't need anyone. I was still a city girl, as stubborn as a mule, but that only lasted for a couple of weeks. At 7 months pregnant, I was hemorrhaging again, so Granny took me to the local hospital. Unfortunately, they were too small of a place to handle a premature birth, so they sent me off in an ambulance to a teaching hospital further south in Gainesville, Florida. You didn't have to be an Einstein to figure out that they were practicing on all of us. I was lying in a room and listening to a lady cry out. I don't know if you know this or not, but when you're dying, you know it. So I yelled for some help. This young trainee came from behind the curtain and pulled my sheets down. They were soaked in blood. And praise God, a doctor was walking by to go check on the lady who was screaming in the other area. The doctor looked at me and said to the young girl, "Get her to surgery, stat." Boy, did they start moving. The next thing I remember is them waking me up saying, "It's a girl, ma'am. She's a little blue but alive." I was obviously relieved and stayed at the hospital for a good while. I had lost a lot of blood and was exhausted. There was nothing normal about having this baby, Samantha. She weighed in a little less than 3 pounds. Everyone whispered around me when they would talk about her. They had me hooked up to 2 IVs, and I kept hearing the word neonatology unit. Russ and Granny and the nurses just kept saying Samantha was fine and that I should just concentrate on myself. Well, of course, that wasn't possible for me, a young mother who was high-strung and from Las Vegas. After about a week had passed, I was over it, and I formed a plan to go see my baby. I didn't know if she was deformed or what, but I was bound and determined to see her. I waited until 3 a.m. in the morning when the hospital was really quiet. Somehow, by God's grace, I worked the IV poles around the bottom of my bed and got them both together, which became like a couple of ski poles. I had a hospital gown on, tacked on the back with a pad on for bleeding, and I worked my way out of the room. I made so much noise, it was another miracle they didn't hear me. I got out and was going very slowly down the hall to where I heard everyone say Samantha was. When I made it to the neonatology unit, I pushed the door open, making even more noise to get in there. I couldn't believe that late-night nurse didn't hear me at first. When she turned around, I really startled her. I felt a little bad for that, but I was on a quest to see my baby. She said, "Ma'am, can I help you with something?" I told her yes in a loud voice, and that I wanted to see my baby. She said, "Calm down. What's your name?" I told her, and she said Samantha was fine and that she was beautiful. The nurse then said, "She's right over there." I didn't know if I was going to have to hit her with one of my poles, but fortunately, she asked me if I wanted to see her. I eased up to the incubator where my daughter was, in total suspense of what I might see. I looked inside, and there she was, Samantha. She was indeed beautiful, but very, very small. The nurse asked me if I wanted to hold her. I told her no. I asked her if she had all her fingers and toes. She said, yes, she's perfect, just a little small. I looked around at the other babies in the room, and I noticed right away that Samantha's head was round. Most of the preemies, they had skinny heads. So that did my heart good, and I returned to my room. I was the talk of the hospital the next day, but satisfied by what I saw. They told me I would be discharged, but that Samantha would have to stay for 3 weeks or so until she weighed at least 4 pounds before they could legally release her. I agreed and went back to the farm to heal. The day finally came for Samantha to be released. Russ came in from the road to take us home. I was very scared, very young, and didn't know I would have to feed her every 2 hours round the clock. At first, it was very hard, but after one time, after another time, and probing her like a baby bird to eat, I figured out what to do. Once again, I overcame and got on a schedule, but that totally was exhausting. I was bound and determined that she would live. I knew in my heart she was on the planet for some very important reason. But what they didn't tell me was about her rear end. I went to change her diaper, and to my surprise, there was a big, giant, red, scary-looking thing that covered her whole butt. I was totally freaked out. I called the hospital, yelling at the doctor, and asked what it was and why they didn't prepare me for it. He apologized and told me it was called a hemangioma, which is a fancy term for birthmark. He said that with care, it would go away in a few years. I was still freaked out about the whole deal. Every time Samantha would go to the potty, the feces would get all over the birthmark and it would crack and bleed. So I called the doctor back and asked, what do you do about this? He told me Vaseline, a lot of it. So I would go to the drugstore and buy a large amount of Vaseline, and people would just stare at me. It's funny how people assume things they have no clue about. I got very good at caring for this teeny one until one night we had a couple over to play cards. Something told me to go and check on the baby. I went in there and she wasn't moving and looked almost purple. I screamed for my husband to come in there. I poked at her leg, no movement. He came running into the room, picked her up in the air, and yelled out as loud as he could, "Live!" My goodness. The friends we had over were standing there and they saw what I saw. Russ actually shouted the baby back to life. It was the power of words. We can speak life or we can speak death. In this case, we all witnessed the baby coming back to life and crying. My friend Lisa and I were so scared about the whole thing. The men left the room and we both cried and tried to pull it together after what we both had just witnessed. It was totally amazing. After all that, I was more determined to get the baby into where she could just eat and put on weight. So I put the baby food in the bottle and put a hole in the top of the nipple so she could suck it down. The doctors told me I couldn't do this, but what a lot of people do wrong is they completely listen to a doctor who isn't around all the time and is merely going by statistics. I was bound and determined not to be a statistic, so I did it anyway. The result that Samantha's growth was miraculous. They would ask me what I was doing because she couldn't eat this or that, but the proof was in the pudding. Grow she did, but with lots of help from both God and some good old-fashioned ingenuity. As both girls, Jody and Samantha, started getting older and things became somewhat normal, I started noticing the paperwork Russ would bring in and leave on the counter when he'd come in from the road. I started to look at the 8% all the time. So I asked him what it was. He told me it was the freight broker's fee. I said, what does that mean? He said, they're the ones who get me the loads for the truck. I said right then and there, that's what I'm going to be. Chapter 3, Winging Business 101. So Russ told me he'd get me a trucking contact, and he did. He got me the number for a guy in Wildwood, Florida. Now then, I didn't know the first thing about trucking, but I was always a good salesman. So I got an appointment to go see this guy named Dave. I got all gussied up and looking good for the meeting, then got a sitter and drove to Ocala, Florida. I wasn't really sure what I would say when I got there, but I figured I would just wing it. So I walked into the office with two men behind their desks. One of the guys looked like Cool Daddy Joe, and the other one had black horn-rimmed glasses and weighed about 350. I had talked to Dave on the phone, and I assumed, which you should never do, that Cool Daddy was Dave. No, it was Black Horn-Rim. So I introduced myself, and we went to lunch. Dave was about 40 years old, and I was 20-something. He ordered spaghetti while I ordered a salad. Wow, it was interesting and scary to watch him eat. It was hard for me to pay attention to the conversation with the spaghetti sauce flying all over the place, but we got through it, and he was really a nice guy. He put me in touch with the owner, who told me he would give me $25 a load for every truck I found to carry his freight. It sounded easy enough, but I had no clue what I was up against. This was back in the day where you had to physically see the truck before you could load it. The truckers had to actually sign a 12-page lease agreement and put operating placards with your company's name on their truck to do one single load. I was very labor-intensive, to say the least. Since I lived in the middle of nowhere on a farm called Rocky Acres, 20 miles from civilization, let alone where the truckers might be, it became exhaustive. But once again, I was determined to beat the odds. Being from Las Vegas, I didn't actually gamble, but somehow I was a gambler when it came to business. I ended up driving every day to a truck stop in Lake City, Florida. I would sit around, listen to the drivers, and would ask them if they needed a load. I would snag a driver here and there, but they would have to drive to the farm to sign all the paperwork, called a trip lease. I set up an office out there on the farm in a small trailer we had, and I had a few trucks a week at $25 a load. This was in the late 70s, and it got old pretty fast. I knew I needed to get closer to the drivers, which meant I needed to get an office at the Jacksonville I-10 truck stop on the west side of town. I didn't have any money, but I did have a lot of faith. I called Dave and asked him if he'd work for me for $250 a week. He said, honey, I don't know what it is about you, but I'll do it. So I got the office, installed the phones, and called some guy in California at least 100 times, and he finally called me back. His name was Bob. He was with Keystone Lines in Anaheim, California. Bob asked me what I wanted, so I told him I wanted to be an agent for his company. He said that anyone as persistent as I was, he just had to meet. He said that he'd be in Florida the following week and we'd have lunch. I was very much prepared to meet a big dog in the trucking industry. I met Bob at a small truck stop near Ocala in Wildwood, Florida. When I saw him, I just couldn't believe it. Bob had a big, deep voice, but was only about 5 feet 5 inches tall and weighed about 160 pounds. I actually laughed when I saw him for the first time. He asked me at lunch if I had any customers. And I faked through the conversation, not even knowing what customers really were. I fibbed, lied like a dog, and told him I did indeed have some customers. Then he asked for the names of some of them. I told him Anheuser-Busch just came flying out of my mouth. They were based out of Jacksonville, Florida, and it would be a great backhaul for the truckers that are coming out of Florida for most motor carriers. So the meeting went well, and Bob signed me up as an independent agent for Keystone Lines. I thought, wow, I need to get into Anheuser-Busch somehow and really quick. I asked my mentor, Dave, who had been in the industry all of his life. Dave, he had been a bed bug. For you who don't know what this is, in the trucking lingo, It's a furniture mover, like Mayflower. If you're moving carriers like this, they pack your stuff and they move it from point A to point B and unload everything. So I asked Dave if he could get me an appointment with Anheuser-Busch, and he actually did. From there, I went into the first sales call in the customer's facility. I was very confident that I could do anything. I just didn't know exactly how. The transportation manager's name was Jim. I showed up to my appointment, and he met me in the lobby, got me a hard hat and some glasses, and took me into the facility. I couldn't believe it. The first thing I noticed was how clean the beer plant was. It was absolutely immaculate. My next thought was the beer drinkers on this planet aren't going to catch any germs drinking this stuff. It was hilarious. I actually said that to Jim, and he laughed. We went to his office and sat down. Jim immediately started talking to me with a series of questions, like how long I had been in the trucking, etc. Now, remember, I was only 20-something years old at the time. So I told him I was an old professional from way back and that I could move every stitch of beer out of Jacksonville to wherever he wanted it to go. He then drilled me about rates. Back then, they had just gotten used to not having to have tariffs, which meant you had to sign up with the government and have your rates on file. So he said a standard rate, and if I could meet that rate, that he would consider using my services. You don't know this, but because I really didn't know it myself, but I was full of faith and piss and vinegar both at the same time. I told Jim that I'd meet the rate of his 80 cents a mile out of Jacksonville, and I'd move more beer than he'd ever believe. At this, he started laughing. He said, "Honey, how old are you?" I think I told him I was 20. I think I lied. Wow. With this kind of guts, he says, "I'm going to have to give you a try." Thank God he said okay, since I already told the Bob guy at Keystone I had the account. I had really gambled on the situation. I also knew that someone was looking out for me, and so did Dave in my office. When I came back from the appointment, he said, "How'd it go, honey?" I said, "Dave, I got the account." He couldn't believe it. He asked me how much I got on the rates. I told him, and he asked me how we were going to be able to move the freight. I told him I didn't know. But what I did know was that Bob was a believer at Keystone because we had the account. Dave, being older, wiser, and understanding the industry, said, "I don't know what it is about you. Somehow I believe in you." He had to have seen what I know now is faith, but then it just looked like plain old craziness. So off we went to move some beer across the United States. I didn't realize it until we already got to the end of the game that the rates were cheap and the trucks wanted more money. Of course, I was greener than grass, but Dave wasn't. So if we were going to be able to keep the phones, lights, and out of the office open at the truck stop, we had to move some freight. Dave was also what the industry calls an LTL expert. LTL means less than truckload. But he knew the geography. He knew the map. He was a walking map. He knew the map of the United States like the back of his hand. So Dave was very, very much like a walking, talking map. When I started into the trucking, I didn't realize that I could talk my way into just about anything. When I got to work each day, I would yell for Dave and we'd start working. So off we went, booking loads of LTLs. Dave also had a few friends in the lumber business. Like I said, back in the day, you had to physically see the truck, not like it is in 2020, where it's a piece of cake to a broker, where you can just book a load and not even see the truck. You really had to work hard at getting a load for trucks because you had to physically see them. By the grace of God, we were at the position at the Jacksonville I-10 truck stop. That's where everybody stopped to fuel coming in and out of Florida. So it was a very good spot to talk to drivers. After a while, Dave and I developed a regular following of trucks that depended on us to get them out of Florida. I still lived on the farm in Live Oak and had a couple of kids, a husband, and a challenging new career. The whole 9 yards. I drove every day, round trip, 100 miles to make it happen. By then, my husband had bought himself a truck and was doing his own thing with hauling equipment, which neither Dave nor I wanted anything to do with. We had to have a company name to be an agent for Keystone, so we picked R&R Transport. One time we had a visit from Landstar, a Landstar rep who came into our office on a busy day at the truck stop to try and sign us up with him. He was a young buck who thought he knew everything. The rep was on our phone, and we only had a couple of lines at a very small office. So I told him to get off our phone and threw him out of the office. The way I saw it, we were doing better than he was. Being Landstar wasn't very big at the time. Dave couldn't believe I threw him out, but we had drivers lined up down the hallway waiting for their handwritten trip laces from me and Dave. Ultimately, I grew weary of the drive back and forth from the farm to the truck stop in the west side of Jacksonville, so I started looking for somewhere to live in a small town called Baldwin, Florida. I wasn't exactly in a marriage that was great, so I told my business partner, Dave, I wanted to move from the farm closer to the job. With Dave being a bed bug and all, I asked him if he would help me with this, and he said, "Sure I will, honey. We'll find you a place." I really didn't care about my marriage. I was on a mission to get away from the farm and away from whatever weird spirit was on my husband. Back then, I went to a Baptist church out in the middle of nowhere in Live Oak. I would dress my two girls up, and three of us would go off to church on Sunday. Being from Las Vegas, it gave me the chance to dress up, look pretty, and go to church. I honestly didn't know much about the spirit world at the time, except for I knew that being from Las Vegas, they were certain kinds of spirits because they came out in the booze. Of course, you can always tell if someone is drinking. For some, if it's rum, it's one spirit. If it's tequila, it's another spirit. Jack Daniels, it's another spirit, and so on. All I knew was the spirit of my husband wasn't a good one. So I asked the preacher of this little dinky white church in the middle of nowhere if he believed in spirits. By the way, I know now it was actually demons. The pastor's name was Norman. He was a young preacher from California. He said, "Yes, I do. Why?" I told him that I saw a giant spirit on my husband and asked if he could come out to my house and talk to Russ and see if he could see it. He said he would, so I made the appointment and made sure Russ was there. Norman came to our house on the farm. I'll never forget where Russ was sitting on the floor against the wall when the preacher came in. We chatted for a few minutes, and it wasn't long before he left. I walked outside with Norman and said, "Did you see it?" He told me he did. I said, "Well, what do you do about it?" He said he'd get back with me. In the meantime, I was still focused on getting out of Dodge, or rather Live Oak. About a week later, the preacher called and said we were going to do a round-the-clock prayer chain for the situation with Russ, and he wanted everyone to take 30 minutes for a 24-hour period. He said he wanted younger people to do the late-night portion, the early wee hours from 1 a.m. to 5 a.m. This would mean that the older folks didn't have to be up that late. I picked 4 a.m. Now, I won't ever forget this event as long as I live. I ended up relieving whoever was there for that earlier shift, so I was suddenly in a little church in the middle of the night by myself. The church had red carpet, and for one night, for my 30 minutes, I prayed, cried, and basically had one of the most awesome encounters of my life at the altar on my knees. It was real. It was incredible. I really don't know how to describe it. I just knew that a power greater than I was there to listen to me. So I spilled my heart, and that was it. My 30 minutes was up, and I went home. You would think I would have thought a lot about it after that, but I didn't. I was still focused on my impending move, my trucking agency, and moving forward in life. Then one Sunday, I got a call from every person that lived on the farm. Granny called and informed me that they were going to church. Russ's brother's wife called and said that they were going to church. His sister called and said the same thing. They were all going to church. I thought it was kind of weird, but I was used to going every Sunday, so I told them, "Okay, I'll see you there." When I was getting ready to walk out the door, Russ came running out of the room and told me, wait for him, that he was also going to church. I thought it was really weird. But with all the things on my mind, I'd forgotten about the prayer chain. So we all went to church that morning. What happened next totally blew my mind. Halfway through the service, Russ jumped up, dropped to his knees, and said, "Get it out of me." When he did, all these old folks, who I found out later were elders, come over and laid their hands on Russ. When it was over, no lie, Russ left that church a different person. Literally, he was completely a different person. That's when I knew the prayer chain had worked and that God really does hear us. Since my husband became a different person, he actually signed on the house in Baldwin with me. My friend Dave the bedbug showed up to help us move our junk to the new home. Leaving the farm was actually very difficult for me. I had learned how to be a woman, to cook, to clean, to sew, and just take care of a family. But I knew that wasn't all there was for me to do. My business was growing, and Dave and I were loading trucks. We got to the point where both of us were very good in penmanship and very quick, and we would make $20 for every trip lease we did. Before we knew it, we were in what they call the $1 Million Club, which meant we had done $1 million in gross revenue, all in $20 increments. This absolutely blew the minds of the big dogs we were dealing with. They couldn't believe it. So when you do $1 million in sales, they take you to a nice resort or place to celebrate. One day I got the memo confirming this over the fax machine. Back in the day, very few people actually had a fax machine. So I get this fax over the fax machine that says that we had won a trip because we were in the $1 Million Club. But the memo said it was a trip to Las Vegas. Wow. Needless to say, I wasn't very excited because I had grown up there. I wanted to go to like Hawaii or something. My husband and I went to the conference, and Dave stayed back home. Now remember, we had to have a business name to sign our agency up with the company. So when they called the name out, they said, "We want you to meet someone who worked 5 times as hard as the Detroit office, which moves automotive parts, and they did 5 times the paperwork for the money, all in $20. They were impressed with the amount of work done, and then they called my husband up there, the president of the company, to get the award. Well, me and Dave had done all the labor. He actually didn't have anything to do with mine and Dave's labor, but he took the glory and the trophy. I felt bad for Dave more than myself. He deserved the trophy, not Russ. But one thing I've learned is that God has a way of turning things around for your good when it looks like you got the raw end of a deal. So that's Romans 8:28. And we know that all things works together for good to those who love God, who have been called according to his purpose. Russ had been doing his own trucking, learning in his equipment business. He was all about some equipment, while Dave and I were slow and steady, which always wins the race. And just for a quick side note, I never did move a lot of beer. It was very difficult to move due to the low rates. I found this out, and I grew in the business. Anyway, we finally moved and settled into the new life in Baldwin. I had a steady business that was growing, and later I got pregnant again, 7 years after Samantha was born. Russ originally wanted a bunch of boys, but he had girls and didn't exactly care for that. When I was pregnant, my niece decided to get married in Las Vegas, so I got on a plane when I was 8 months pregnant along with my 2 daughters. Now, this was back in the day when they actually fed you a meal when you flew across the country. So we were on the plane, and the ovens were on full blast. It was very hot. At one point, I thought I was going to pass out. My girls were still young then, so they weren't old enough to help me. By the grace of God, a flight attendant saw my plight and bolted into action. She grabbed the back of my neck, slapped a cold rag on it, and pushed my head between my legs. This wasn't very easy because I had a lot of baby down there. I couldn't believe it. I couldn't actually bend over like that. But she literally saved me from passing out. The attendant waited a few minutes and asked me if I was ready to fly. I told her yes, and off we went to Vegas. When I got there, everyone was running around doing this or that for the wedding. At 8 months pregnant, I really couldn't move that swiftly, but I endured. During that trip, I came to find out that heroin had been the drug of choice for everyone out there, and I was looking around like, help me. My niece was always a straight lacer, so she wasn't wasted at all. Since that's who I was there for, I stayed and helped as much as I could. My daughters were her flower girls, but the church where she had her wedding ceremony had a broken air conditioner in the middle of the desert, and it was hot. Needless to say, everyone was miserable. I felt so sorry for my niece, but if you recall the story I told you about my own wedding, her ceremony was glorious compared to mine. My brother Tiki was there, and he needed help, but I couldn't even help him because I couldn't even help myself. I was 8 months pregnant, so I put my business card on his mirror and told him that if he wanted to pull it together, he could call me. We flew back to Florida, and one day soon after that, I found myself sitting on the floor in the house, cleaning out my purse. I was used to a lot of foot traffic, a lot of people coming in and out of the house. Being in the trucking business, you get used to being around a lot of people at the same time. So these shoes walk up to me while I was sitting on the floor, and I look over and said, no way. It was my brother's feet. I asked what he was doing there because I was about to have a baby. He said he was strung out on heroin, and my sister had loaned him $300 to get him off the stuff. I kicked into high gear and found him a room in an old white house in our little town of Baldwin. I got everything he needed, blankets, food, and everything, and told him that he would have to fight it. It was his fight. What I know now is that it was a demon that was put in his life, but it ended up being by the grace of God that he kicked heroin. Tiki actually did it. He kicked heroin in the face. Meanwhile, I had a full staff of workers and a date in October when they would give me a C-section. This was back in the day where they didn't have any sonograms. Back then, you didn't know whether you were going to get a boy or a girl. So I told Dave I was going to have the baby and to hold down the fort and that I'd be back soon. Thank God for Dave. He said, okay, honey. Off I went to Valdosta, Georgia to have a C-section. Granny and Russ got a room and spent the night because surgery was always early in the morning. The next morning, they wheeled me into the OR. Well, I woke up, and they said I had a boy. I couldn't believe it. I asked Granny 5 times, are you sure? I just knew it would be a girl, and I was going to name her Johnny or Georgia, keeping my consistent boy names for Russ. Joe, Sam, and George or John, boy names. No, it was Kyle. Kyle would be his name. Russ was happier than a lark because he wanted boys all along. All of this was happening when AIDS had just come on the scene, and everybody was freaked out about it. The doctor came in and told me I had lost a lot of blood during the surgery and they needed to give me a blood transfusion. I told him no way. I asked him if he could give me a guarantee because I wasn't going to get AIDS from a blood transfusion. He told me he'd guarantee it. He said that they checked it out, blah, blah, blah. But it was a stern no from me. The doctor said if I didn't take it, I would drop dead. And so I told him to let me think about it. I laid there thinking, what about the kids? If I somehow didn't pull through, what kind of life were they going to have without their mother? Which I understood how that was. The girls were a lot older now, and I could imagine what they would do if I didn't take the chance. So I called my husband, but he was never very compassionate. He was like calling, well, I'll leave that alone. Anyway, I decided to take the transfusion. It was awful and painful. Fortunately, my room was full of flowers because I was not only a businesswoman, but I was also blessed with many friends and family. I probably had 24 floral arrangements in my hospital room. That was a lot. The time came for my husband to come pick me up and our son Kyle and take us home. Back in that day, we had an old-fashioned panel station wagon, a green one like the Chevy Chase movie Vacation. I was in the room waiting like mother would for her husband to come pick us up, and into the room came 2 men. one with my husband Russ, and the other, let's call him Jed, who lived on the Rocky Acre farm. Jed had been grandfathered into the family when he was 12 or 13 years old. They were both wasted. Unfortunately, that was back in the Coke days. Once again, I couldn't believe it. I asked what they were doing. They said they were coming to pick me up. I had no idea the dramatic effect that would have for many years to come. So Russ got my flowers onto a cart. The nurse pushed me out, and Jed, my baby son Kyle, he walked him out to the car. There was something very strange about this whole thing, even though it would make sense until years later. There was nothing normal about any of this. Nothing normal at all. Chapter 4. Becoming a broker for trucking. When I got home, I hired a nanny to help me take care of the household because I had a lot of business, a lot of employees, a lot of trucks, and a lot of family. Everybody needed something. It always seemed like when somebody needed something, they would find me, and somehow I was always willing to help. When I got used to Kyle being on the planet, I poured myself into the trucking company and figured out that being an agent, that they were taking too large a chunk of the percentage we made in our commissions. So I developed an eagerness to become a freight broker. Not many at the time were freight brokers, except maybe 5,000 people in the entire country. So I decided to get my own broker's license. My sister Franny in Las Vegas was still hooked up with a bunch of lawyers. So I called her and asked her to convince them to help me get a license. Back in that day, it was very difficult to get one, almost unheard of. But they got the job done, and I became one of the game changers in our industry. I often laugh now in 2020 at the paperwork that they're emailing all over the planet because I helped to initially create it. They copied and put their names on it, much like Dave and I did with our $1 million in 20s. We perfected the way to get a truckload on the truck with little or no fuss with the paperwork, having paid a great price and doing all those trip leases in the past. By the time the people knew we had a fax machine, they didn't even know what a fax machine was. They had the old DAT, available truck board. Notice was all in the monitors in the truck stops. We ultimately went to computers, which changed the dynamic of the industry once again. The broker's license I was issued helped me to move quickly for obtaining our own trucks so that we could move quickly for our customers. Back then, there was still no cell phones. Drivers still had to stop and call in for dispatch to get their loads, but somehow it was easier. R&R transport had become everything. A freight broker, a trucker, a heavy equipment hauler, you name it, we did it. Our motto was, you call, we haul. We were actually pretty big in the industry, but with our big name came a lot of pressure. I had no idea how much, and truthfully, the fact that I was a type of a trucking queen was an oxymoron. I thought I would do something big for the planet when I was a little kid, but trucking, I would have never even thought that. I was always the people person who seemed like I could help and answer your questions, but I really didn't know where the talent came from. However, I was always good at it. I found out later God gives us talents and expects us to use them. Like he says in Ephesians 2:10, for we are God's handiwork, created in Christ Jesus to do good works, which God prepared in advance for us to do. That's Bible. We were a happy little family of truckers, loading everybody else's trucks until the bottom fell out of our little family. For a while, things between my husband and I seemed to be okay. He was out of town a lot, rigging equipment for people. I stayed home with the kids and tended to the trucking business. But through this, I noticed things didn't seem to be quite right. I knew that some door had opened somehow, but I couldn't explain it. I took my kids and went regularly to a small church in Baldwin. There was a pastor there named Ben. I really didn't care for him that much, but it didn't matter. My kids were going to church, and that's what really mattered to me. During that time, I began noticing that our business phones weren't ringing at all. They weren't ringing much, and the business in general was failing. Russ was always gone, and my brother from Las Vegas, Jerry, drove all the way from Baldwin for me to help him. He said, "Rock, do you believe in demons?" I said, yes, that I did, and I asked him why. He said, well, they're definitely real, and based on what I've seen, they haven't come up with anything in Hollywood like it. He told me that they were in his car, taking the Kleenex out, taunting him all the way from Florida to Vegas. All I could think was, help me. In case you can't tell, that's one of my expressions. Anyway, I had no idea what to do about this. Russ came home, and I told him what my brother said. So he set a bunch of plates on the table for my brother's little friends and laughed in his face. I knew it was bigger than that, so I called the pastor, Ben, and asked him to come to my office so I could talk with him. When he arrived, I asked him if he believed in demons. He said he did, and I said, my phones aren't ringing, my brother is freaking out, my husband is leaving on a job, and I need help. What do I do? Ben told me to plead the blood of Jesus and ask for a hedge of protection. I asked him, what does that mean? He told me to say it out loud in the office and to tell it to go in the name of Jesus Christ. At that time, this was way out there for me, but I didn't forget Live Oak and the Pastor Norman's round-the-clock prayers, so I did it. Myself and this girl named Debbie stood in the office and commanded what wasn't of God to leave in Jesus' name, and I'm telling you, every one of the phone lines lit up at the same time and started ringing. We were freaked out. My brother Jerry was running around like a chicken with his head cut off, and finally he went back to Las Vegas. My husband was still out of town all the time, and I noticed him growing farther and farther away. The next thing I knew, the driver started telling me that Russ had some girl running around with him on the yards out of town, and that they loved me and wanted me to know about it. After just going through this demonic thing with my brother, I believed anything was possible, so I shut all Russ's cards off. No money for him. When he found out, he was madder than a wet hornet. I told him I had lost my wallet playing pool, but I wasn't going to let him fool around with our lives out there with some girl he met at the Super 8 motel. Now, Jed, remember him, told me he cried and asked Russ what he was doing because he had a beautiful family, a wonderful wife, and everything else a man could ever want. Russ asked Jed if he thought he could do a better job. Jed said, I know I could. Then they shook on it. All of a sudden, I was somehow in the game with both of them. It was weird. Russ came home. When I told him I knew about his girlfriend and that I would forgive him if he just got rid of her, he said he couldn't do that. I said, why not? He said, because he told her he loved her. I asked him why he did that. He said, I don't know. She just moved here from Nashville, and I'm not worthy of you. I know this was the enemy trying to destroy our family. I begged him to please not do this. He just looked at me and through me and said, I still have a roving eye. I didn't know what else to do, so we got divorced on Valentine's Day. The lawyer in the little town was a friend of mine. He told me to take him for everything, because I held all the cards. I said, no, let him have it. I went slap off the deep end, and Jed was my friend trying to console me through this. So what did I do? I told Jed if he wanted to move in with me, we had to be married. So 30 days after the divorce, I married Jed. It was crazy. I didn't even like Jed. He was always so negative, but he played the guitar and smoked cigarettes. So I thought, I'm all in, lock, stock, and barrel. It was pure craziness. Before Jed and I got married, I was in the office one day licking my wounds, and Dave told me it would be okay. Still there was Dave, always faithful, good old Dave. The phone rang, and one of the girls said, hey, Rock, there's a guy on line 4 who says he's your dad, Dave Shunk. I was thinking, no way. I haven't seen him since I was 8 years old. I pick up the phone and said, Daddy. That blew his mind, and we started talking. I flew him into Jacksonville as my life was taking on a very different path. Instead of just me and my little family, I also had Jed and Daddy. So I got some crazy idea that I should move my family to Las Vegas. Oh no, don't ever do that. Don't go backwards. I ultimately loaded up my 2 daughters, my dad, who I hadn't seen in 30 years, my new husband, Jed, who let my dad walk me down the aisle, and I was going off the deep end, and we were getting ready to leave. Unfortunately, Kyle's dad claimed he'd kill us if we took his boy away. What a mess. What I know now is that we have an enemy who wants to kill, steal, and destroy, especially families. So make that especially strong, rooted families, which we were. I found out later, as we go through the valley of the shadow of darkness, this enemy will use every trick in the book to destroy us, to get us off the path we were destined to be on. I really didn't know any of this at that time. Back to the story. We all moved out to Las Vegas. By this time, the girls, Jody and Sammy, were teens, and little Kyle was only 4 years old. We, the girls and I, were devastated when we went to get Kyle at his dad's place to go with us. My ex-husband told us we weren't taking his boy, and like I just said, he said he'd kill us all if we did. We drove away hysterically crying from the pain that the family was being put through. It really looked like the enemy was winning, and there was nothing we could do about it. So we journeyed out to Las Vegas. When we got there, we rented a house and put the girls in school. Wow, that was a bad deal because the schools were eaten up with drugs, drug dealers, and violence. I prided myself in keeping them in a small town where everybody knew everybody and they could walk to a nice school. This was different. This was actually a nightmare. How did I get here, I asked myself. What did I do wrong? I knew deep down I had made some dumb emotional decisions. I found out later in life that you should never make big decisions with emotions ruling over you. It will usually be a bad decision. Yeah, this is some wisdom I thought I'd throw into the book for you. Anyway, so there we all are in Las Vegas in the early 90s. The town was eaten up with hatred, prostitution, drugs, every kind of weirdo you could imagine. I didn't remember what it was really like living there, being a kid, when I last lived in Las Vegas. But I got a quick remembrance. I knew I had to do something. So my sister and her daughter, my niece, came to help me. Working through a pack of lawyer friends, I told them I had to make a decision in marrying Jed, let alone taking him like a hillbilly from Florida and my girls to Las Vegas. They sprang into action and created a divorce decree only 6 months later. So I told Jed that he had to leave. I had a couple of friends, Bill and Sam in Northtown, Vegas, who asked, "Where'd you get the hillbilly, Rock?" They said, "You need to get him out of here before somebody gets killed, and our money's on the hillbilly." So I told Jed it had been too soon for me to get remarried and he would have to go back to Florida. He left Las Vegas with a wounded spirit, and I felt terrible. But I had to start somewhere. Jed tried to get me to reconsider, and I believed I was half nuts from all the emotions of 15 years of marriage and never dealing with it. So the next bright idea was to get the girls out of Las Vegas as they got older, because this was not the place for them. They were absolutely beautiful. The boys on the city blocks on rollerblades were like a pack of dogs at my door when I came home. No, that wasn't going to happen. So I called their dad and told him we needed to fly them back to him, putting them back in their schools and with Kyle until I could figure out what to do about my derailed train. It was a dang mess. The time to fly came for the girls to go back to Florida. I took them to the airport and told them to hold hands and get on the plane, that I would come and get them when I knew what I was going to do. I knew I had to make money somehow, so even though Russ told me it couldn't be done, I opened up a brokerage agency in Vegas with my sister as a partner. Wow, that was a nightmare. I signed on with a company called Sureway Transportation, which was just getting off the ground in 1989, as an agent for them. Unfortunately, I didn't realize the time difference would be so dramatic. I would have to be on the phone at 3 a.m. Las Vegas time to even be in the East Coast game because they were all moving and shaking before the sun even came up in Nevada. It was awful. I managed to use some of the customers from my old company R&R, which rapidly closed due to the divorce, and found a girl to work with me. But everything was still crazy. There was actually a different lingo on the West Coast. They didn't call it a flatbed. They called it something else, which I never did figure out what they called it. I told my sister I couldn't handle it, and she wasn't very happy about the whole thing. But at that point, I had no idea what to do. I was getting served paperwork from Russ saying I was a whore who had abandoned my kids. I was a lot of things, but I was never a whore and would never abandon a stranger, let alone my kids. I cried and cried, feeling like I was being punished for something I didn't even know I did. My sister, Franny, still worked for a bunch of attorneys, and she said, let's take him out, Rock, meaning let's sue him. She had the power and the money, but I told her no, let's let God deal with it. She thought I was nuts for not retaliating with vengeance. Somehow I knew in the long run that it would be okay. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to give you hope and a future. I didn't know then what I know now, but it makes more sense these days. So there I was in my rental house, kids gone, husband's gone, business up in the air. One day I just dropped to my knees in my bedroom and cried out, "What do you want me to do?" It was very, very emotional. I had always been very, very hard-headed, but this whole thing was way out there even for me. The next thing I knew, the phone rang and it was Jed. He told me he wanted the little business I had started before we left Florida, a repo business, like Recovery Masters in this day and age would be much like Dog the Bounty Hunter. I listened to what he had to say, but all I could hear in my head was, ask him to come get you. So I hem-hawed around and finally said, look here, Jed, if you come out here to Las Vegas and load me and my junk up and take me back to the East Coast, I'll stand by you every step of the way. He told me he didn't have any money. I told him I would send him some. He said that he'd do it, so I sent him the money, and he was there in about 30 hours. That's pretty quick. When he arrived, he looked like a starving dog. He drove a Camaro with no air or heat, but at least he came. I've always been the type of person where my word is my bond, so even though we were divorced after 6 months, I asked Jed to remarry me on the same day, June the 1st, that I married him the year before. He did, and we went to the Justice of the Peace with my friend Bill and his woman. It was a double ceremony. One thing Las Vegas is known for is a quick marriage for sure. After that, it was time for me to get ready to exit Sin City. My dad, who originally came with us, lived in a little subsidized apartment. He had come back into my life just when I needed him. When everything that was going on, I actually had a lot of fun with my dad. His name was Gustav, but everybody called him Dave. It seemed like the Daves in my life were great helpers for me. I asked Dad all kinds of questions like where he was for 30 years. I didn't hold any unforgiveness for him, which he found to be quite unbelievable. I just wanted to know how and his version of what happened. We laughed and cried and joked around, but he asked me not to ask him where he had been for all those years. So I left it alone. I knew he was mafia, but I didn't know that Sheriff Lamb had thrown him out of Las Vegas when he was 30 years old. It made more sense as an old man. He was no threat and things that had changed so dramatically, but Lamb was still the sheriff. It was weird. The day finally came that I told him that I was leaving Vegas and going home to the East Coast, even though I really didn't exactly know what that meant. He asked me where I was going. I told him I didn't know. He asked me if I was sure I wanted to do this. I said positive. Dad didn't like my sister Franny very much, and the feeling was mutual. My brother Jerry was still in Vegas working at the Hilton serving Elvis Presley breakfast in the mornings. Dad decided to call a meeting of his kids at his little home. My little brother Tiki was in Florida, so he wasn't there, but we all went to his house for a meeting. I never laughed so hard in my life. This group of us was like a bunch of fruitcakes. That's the only way to explain it. My sister was carrying her torch from the past. My brother Jerry was wasted on weed. I wasn't sure what was going on, and my dad was trying to be serious. I had to belly laugh himself at everything. It was a moment I feel that God arranged for us to be together one last time. It was unforgettable. I told all of them I was going back to the East Coast. They asked me where I was going. I still didn't have a clue. All I knew was I had to get back to where my kids were. Jed had a couple of boys in Ohio, so I tried to think about him too. So I hired a U-Haul truck. I had a house full of furniture to load, 15 years of stuff that I brought clear across the United States, and it needed to go back. My lease was up on the house, so it finally came to time for us to leave. My sister was angry because she hated Jed, but the way I saw it, it was my ticket out of the hellhole of Las Vegas. It was finally time for me to get ready to get out of there. Chapter 5. Beginning my mission. In the meantime, my ex-husband had control of all my kids. One time he called me because my son was crying for his mama. Well, I guess so. Kyle's whole world had been ripped apart. So I asked Russ to fly him out to me in Vegas because I was moving back east. Russ always had some motive of why he would do anything, so he told me if I would sign custody of Kyle over to him, he would fly him out for a visit. It was my son, and he needed his mother. At that point, I would have signed anything, just anything. I was desperate. I signed the paperwork and Kyle flew in. Jed and I picked him up at the airport, and I bought a Ninja Turtle toy, Raphael, for Kyle. Back in that day, it was a big thing. When he got off the plane, all I could see was a frightened little boy with his world ripped apart, and I needed to love him back to wholeness. He was scared at first, being only 4 years old, but he warmed up quickly and was fine. We were busy packing and getting everything in the U-Haul when little Kyle asked where we were going. I told him we were going home, but I really didn't know what that meant. To me, the East Coast was just somewhere out there. To him, it looked like reconciliation, but he didn't understand. I'm not sure I even understood. Russ ended up marrying the girl from the Super 8. Her name was Ginger, and she was pregnant. I made it a point to send cards to my girls once a week to let them know how much I missed them. Their father would tell them I didn't love or care about them, which of course was a lie. But until I could get into a good environment, Russ just rocked on with the lies. We finally got the U-Haul loaded up and ready to go. Unfortunately, I didn't have much money, but I had enough to get us back to the East Coast. From there, we would really need some help. Actually, we needed a miracle. So me and Jed and little Kyle loaded up the U-Haul and started out our way out of Las Vegas up through Hoover Dam. When we got out of the desert, all of a sudden the truck caught on fire and Kyle started yelling and panicking. We were burning. I guess I drank Pepsi by the liter back in that day because Jed grabbed the Pepsi, jumped out of the truck, and put the fire out of the brakes on the truck with the soda. We all three got out of the truck, out in the desert, dropped on the ground on our knees, and prayed for God to help us get out of there and to give us safe passage back to the East Coast. We started off again and went across the beautiful plains of the United States. Kyle would ask, "What that, Mommy? What about that?" He asked many, many questions, which kept things lightened up since I didn't have first clue where we were headed. Jed kept asking me, "Where are we going?" All I could say was east. I know now that this was an Abrahamic moment. For example, the Lord has says to Abram, "Go from your country, your people and your father's household to the land I will show you." Yes, this was just plain old faith. When we started getting close to Alabama, Jed mentioned that he had some family there.
I immediately responded with, "No, not family. Stay back." I was really thinking about trucking. When his kids being from Ohio and mine in Florida, I knew from experience that Atlanta was a hub. Everybody had to go through Atlanta to go anywhere on the East Coast, so I mentioned it to Jed. He told me there was a city growing and pretty cool. Then he said he had a friend who had a tire store in a little town called Winder, Georgia, northeast of the city. I asked how far from Atlanta it was. He told me it was 40 minutes. I said, "Okay, let's go there." Thank you for checking out this first volume of my story. Please stay tuned for future installments of my personal testimony. I believe you'll be blessed by it and learn from me what I've learned in life. I still have a lot to tell you, and with God's help, I'll get it out to you soon. Before you go, let's talk for a moment about salvation. First off, what is salvation? What does salvation actually mean? To me, it starts with the fact that all of us have encounters in our lives which you cannot explain. In my case, as you've just read, I have two voices speaking to me from a very young age. One voice told me good things to do, and if I listened to the other one, I went down a dusty trail. In other words, I went the wrong direction. As we walk this journey together, you'll see in my story just how many times a higher power has intervened for me. I really want you to know who this higher power truly is. His name is Jesus Christ. During my story, I called him God a lot. Truthfully, it was indeed God. For the time I was living through what you just read, I really didn't understand who Jesus was and is, but I do now. Maybe you don't know Jesus either. That's okay. I'd like to suggest that you look at your own journey. Have there been things you just couldn't explain? Since there isn't any such thing as coincidence, then who was it exactly that intervened in your life? I encourage you to take a moment and think about it. If you want peace, love, joy, and faith, all you have to do is start with a sincere prayer. And I'm going to give you an example of that prayer. Jesus, I confess that I have sinned and fallen short of your glory. I believe that you suffered and died on the cross for me. And when you did that, you paid the full price for the punishment due me for my sins. Please forgive me for my sins and accept me into your kingdom. Until right now, I have lived only for myself. From now on, I will live only for you. Thank you for your incredible sacrifice. And please also show me how to help others. When it is my time, I look forward to being received into your glorious presence. Please come into my life now, Lord, and forever. In Jesus' name, amen. The end.